Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and so continuing on then with our discussion of Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. Uh, so far, what we've done is we've looked at his triad, and we've looked at his analysis of what he calls the unexplored. Then we looked at the exploration process, the process of translating the unexplored into the known world, and the explored itself. And there's been a particular concern with mapping all of this onto brain architecture. So we looked at very concretely at brain architecture. We're living in a materialist age still, and so the myths are handled in such a way in this age that they don't seem to have any validity unless they're grafted onto some kind of a material substrate. So Peterson feels the necessity to map all of this onto the brain, therefore somehow giving it some kind of legitimacy in the materialistic age. There's an anxiety in that sense. So what he does in this section is he's going to move along into his analysis of the hero myths, where he has the hero, the knower, the son, and the unknown, the great mother, and the known as the great father. And each of them has a bivalent aspect to them. The great mother is bivalent insofar she's basically two characters. We have 7 characters here, according to him. The great mother is bivalent insofar as she is creative and destructive. So we have the devouring mother and the mother who generates creation. With the great father, we have also 2 characters in 2 modes. We have the father who, on his positive side, gives laws and rules for the formation of society, confers order on chaos, and the negative side is the father as tyrant, the one who tries to enforce these rules in such a way that they become overbearing, tyrannical, useless, and need to be overthrown. That brings in the hero with his 2 modalities as hero, as adventurer, explorer on the one hand, and as possible adversary on the other. So we have 7, and then he brings in a new character here called the Ouroboros, the Ouroboric serpent, which is the 7th, who precedes all of this. So in addition to this triad, in good Jungian fashion, wherever Jung says wherever there's a triad, there's a missing 4th. It's usually buried in the unconscious, and so it inevitably has to be brought up to create a quaternio. For Jung, the sacred image was always the mandala, the quaternio. And so for the first time, Peterson starts mentioning a 4th here, the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is the world-encircling serpent, but it's also the prima materia. It's the primordial chaos in which the triad is contained, in which all pairs of opposites, all bivalent ontologies are contained in utero in the beginning, before all of this is separated out through the process of the hero going out to explore all of this. So all of these are encompassed by the Ouroboric dragon, who is sometimes, he says, conflated with the great mothers. Sometimes it's a separate entity. It depends. So he looks at these 2 myths. And the main one that he spends the most time discussing in this chapter is a very long discussion. I think this book needed an editor. It certainly needed a proofreader. It's full of spelling errors, grammatical mistakes, misuse of words. It's a total mess. Obviously, there was no proofreader here. And it also could have used an editor to slice it in half. I think it's monstrously long. And he goes on and on and on and on about a point. Once you've long since gotten the point, he still keeps droning on and on and on about it. I notice he does the same thing in his lectures. So concision would have been nice here. So we have the Enuma Elish. So the Enuma Elish becomes exemplary of this triadic model here. The Enuma Elish is the great Babylonian creation myth. We're not sure when it was written down, sometime between 1700 BC and about 1100 BC. Most scholars favoring somewhere closer to the 1700 mark. So we could probably situate it right around 1500 BC, thereabouts. It means Enuma Elish. It means when on high. So all of this has to do with the realm of the gods up on high. It's a cosmogonic myth that was recited at the Akitu festival, which was held in the month of Nisan, which was on the Babylonian calendar. It was the first month of the year, corresponding to our springtime. And on the 4th day, there were 12 days involved, and on the 4th day, this myth was recited as a cosmogonic myth. It's a cosmogony that tells the tale of the founding and creation of the cosmos. It does it in a certain particular way with a certain particular bias that I think is interesting in light of Peterson's bias against the feminine. So the Enuma Elish. So it begins with a triad with Apsu. Apsu is the god of fresh waters. It means abyss. Apsu becomes abyss. And the word abyss may even have somehow originated from it. They're suspiciously similar words. Apsu means abyss. It's the watery abyss, except that it means fresh water. And I suspect that it actually refers to the freshwater springs surrounding the island of Bahrain, which was ancient Dilmun, was regarded, which was a place that was regarded as the paradisial land for the Sumerians. Everyone wanted to be buried on Bahrain, on Dilmun, because the freshwater springs were coming up out of some mysterious abyss below the island. And so Apsu is associated with fresh waters. And Tiamat is the goddess who is associated with the ocean, the salt waters. And the two are together in the beginning. Apsu is mentioned first, significantly. The male is on top here, whereas as we'll see in the Egyptian myths, the female is always on top. For the Babylonians, though, these are tough tribesmen who have come from the steppe. They were originally the Amorites, and they came raiding in right around the year 2000 or so to establish their dynasty, and they were tough Semitic nomads. They didn't have much regard for the Sumerian worship of goddesses, which I think that they probably regarded the same way the Romans regarded the Greeks, as somewhat effeminate. So anyhow, so we have these three principles. Mumu is their child. Depending on the translation, we're not sure if Mumu means maker or refers to a separate entity, but it looks like a triad with Apsu, Mumu, and Tiamat. Mumu is their first child. And so they mingle. The fresh waters mingle with the salt waters, and they produce the first generation, Lamu and Lahamu. And they apparently represent silt, sediment, river silt. But it looks like they also were at one time threshold guardians, the Lahamu, associated with a shrine that was sacred to the god Enki, who is one of the key gods in this myth. Although he's been dismantled somewhat, deconstructed quite a bit, his power has been by the Babylonians. He was the supreme Sumerian god, the god of intelligence, corresponding to Mercury in the Greek tradition. So they give rise to Lamu and Lahamu, who then in turn give rise to Anshar and Kishar. Note that the names An and Ki were originally in the Sumerian cosmogony, and the Sumerian cosmogony, insofar as we have little fragments of it, simply has Namu, the goddess of the watery abyss, parthenogenetically, which means giving birth without insemination by a male, to An and Ki, An being the sky god, Ki being the earth goddess. She simply gives birth, they just arise out of the water without the insemination by a male. The Babylonians will have none of that. So here we have Anshar and Kishar, and they give birth to Anu, who seems to be a duplication of the An principle, the sky principle. Anu is the supreme sky god, possibly the god of the pole star. And Anu, by some means that's not explained in the myth, gives birth to Ea. The original great Sumerian god, his name was Ea. Later his name changed to Enki, and the Babylonians here name him Nudimmud, but he is the god of the watery abyss. In fact, he is the god of the Apsu, which was associated with one of the first cities in Sumer, Eridu, which is the southernmost city in Mesopotamia, where this god Enki's cult goes way, way, way back. Offerings have been found in early archaeological sites from 5,000–6,000 BC of fish bones dried up on the floor that suggest that this is a very old god, Enki, one of the supreme. He always has the solution to any problem that the other gods have. He's the god of technology, innovation, and solutions. And he's the lord of the watery abyss, the Apsu. So we know he's going to take it over. So we've got Nudimmud Ea coming in. He's the offspring of An. And basically there's an Ennead there. If you count them up, they add up to 9 deities, like the Egyptian Ennead. So there's kind of stoppage there. And there are other gods and goddesses being generated who are unnamed, but they're making too much noise. They're making a lot of racket. And Apsu is irritated by all of this. And he goes to Tiamat and he asks her, is there some way we can get rid of these gods? They're really annoying. This is an echo from a very older Sumerian myth called the Atrahasis, which is the early prototype for the flood myth, in which the great god there was Enlil, the great storm god, whose position in the Enuma Elish, as we'll see, is basically usurped by Marduk as the supreme god. Enlil was the supreme god, the god of thunderstorms, the god of the sky, And he was the god who in the Atrahasis got irritated by the population growth of humans, which irritated them so much that he wanted to cut down the population by sending plagues, famines, and then eventually the flood to wipe out all human beings. So there's an echo of that in this myth. So we know this is a much later myth, the Enuma Elish. Tiamat says, no, leave them alone. They're my creation. They came out of us. They're our offspring. Let them be. Enki, meanwhile, has given birth with his spouse, Damkina, has given birth to Marduk. Marduk's name means the son of the sun, so he may be a sun god here, and Peterson treats him as such, as do most myth scholars, but it is possible, some scholars say that Marduk, the etymology of the name means as son of the sun, is a popular etymology, and if it is, that would explain why Marduk was associated with the planet Jupiter. So we have an apparent sun god here who we know in calendars was associated with the planet Jupiter. So it's difficult to know whether he is in fact a sun god or not. In any event, he does bring light. He does represent the principle of light, bringing the flood of light into the open field of the clearing of the culture. So they decide that Anshar now is very agitated at the noise of all of these deities, and so he sends in Anu to try to do battle with Tiamat, because Tiamat doesn't want her creations messed with. And Ea has a plan to go and kill Apsu, so he goes in and he puts a charm on Apsu that lulls him to sleep, and finally he basically dissipates. And that's simply a retroactive myth explaining how Enki became the lord of the watery abyss. The Apsu was always assigned to Enki, so he's simply there appropriating it. It angers Tiamat quite a bit, though, and she begins to create a brood of monstrous offspring in revenge for that. She creates 11 monsters, and their descriptions indicate that they look pretty much like they are signs of the zodiac. And the 12th member is a character named Kingu, who will be their leader, who will lead them in battle. And he has what's called the tablets of the maze around his neck. May is spelled M-E, and it's pronounced May. And the maze are often fought over, kind of like the ring in Tolkien. They're often fought over in these myths because the maze, the one who possesses the tablets of the maze has the software for the running of civilization. All the programs for the right to be king, all of this stuff is programmed in the maze. And they may very well be astrologically oriented, which is what I suspect is going on here, that the maze have to do with the orbits of the planets and their fatalistic determination. Kingu may be an echo of a priest who studies the will of the goddess. The goddess is always associated with the fatalistic destiny, the mathematically predictable returns and orbits of the planets, which undermine the hero deeds and sound like they undermine free will. And so they are associated with astrology. So I think we've got 12 constellations here is what's going on. And the whole myth of divining and scrying and horoscopy, all of that stuff that gets associated here with Tiamat and these 12 divinities is simply cast aside by the Babylonians. They'll have none of that. Their myth is the Indo-Aryan/Semitic myth of the great warrior hero, the great dragon-slaying warrior hero who is the man of deeds, who does not require a woman to sanctify his deeds. And he will very well overthrow her if necessary, which is what's going on in this myth. So a battle ensues, and Enki puts forth Marduk and says, let's send Marduk in. He'll take care of this. Marduk is my son, and he is the great one who will go in and handle Tiamat. He's got a great bow and arrow, and the bow and arrow is described in such a way as it's kind of a special bow and arrow, which leads me to believe that it's probably a compound bow. And the compound bow came in along with the two-wheeled chariot with the invasions of the chariots in the 17th century BC. So it sounds to me like this myth can't be dated any earlier than 1700 BC because of that. So he goes in with his compound bow. And traditionally now, Marduk is sort of in the role of a storm god. He's going in like a storm going over the ocean. This is what we're supposed to imagine, with lightning bolts. And his arrows that he shoots are essentially thunderbolts. This is the great Indo-Aryan/Semitic thunder-hurling storm god who comes in over the ocean, blows over the waters, and there's a great stormy battle between the sea and the sky for contention as to who is the greater, as Shakespeare puts it in Hamlet. He sends in something that opens up her mouth, a special type of weapon, and the winds blow her belly up, and she becomes tumescent like a balloon, and he simply pops it with his arrow. She pops, and she's dead, done, overthrown, and he goes in, cuts her apart, makes the top half of her the heavens, and the bottom half of her the earth. The Tigris and the Euphrates leak as tears from her eyes, which, by the way, is a very old motif. There are Paleolithic sculptures that show figurines of goddesses leaking rivers of tears from their eyes. It sounds like this association of rivers from the tears of the goddesses, a very old motif, possibly going all the way back to the Paleolithic. And he creates the calendar and does all this cosmogonic stuff, makes a whole new world out of it. Humans, by the way, are created from their leader Kingu, who is bound and slain, and from his blood Marduk creates human beings from his blood, without, note, the aid of a goddess. Now, going back to all the Sumerian versions of the creation of either human beings or the creation of the cosmos, goddesses were always involved. They were always, the maternal vulva was always inactive, whether it was parthenogenetic, as in the myth of Namu giving birth to An and Ki, or whether it was in partnership with Enki. Enki was always the creator god, but always in partnership with the goddess, either Beladili in some accounts, or in other accounts, Enuna, I think it is, where they scoop up riverine mud and make clay figurines and set them out along the riverbanks, 7 men, 7 women, and then they blow breath on them and animate them like Yahweh does in the beginning of the Old Testament with Adam. But it's always done in partnership with the goddess. So it's significant here that the Babylonians have a cosmogony here which completely dismantles the power of the goddess, overthrows her, puts her out of the way, and she has no say in anything. All the creative activities are done by a male god, including the creation of human beings. That's all significant. That's all semiotics going on there. Gender semiotics are going on there. The Babylonians want nothing to do with goddesses and their world, of having them tyrannize over male warrior heroes who know very well what to do and don't need the help of women telling them how to do it. That's coming through very strongly in this myth, I think. So there's that myth, and Peterson's analysis of it comes in now, and he says that, okay, so what we have here, what's going on is the conquest of the Great Mother is the hero's conquest of the unknown. He is the knower who is going forth. Marduk is in the role of the great hero, the knower, who is going forth in the mode of the warrior who conquers the Great Mother, who's the Ouroboric serpent conflated with the Great Mother, the dragon beast. And she is simply dismantled and translated into the known cosmic world with a cosmic map, a sign regime, basically, as the French would call it, that has all of its signifiers referring locked in place into an apparatus of semiotic capture where we know where everything's at. It's the known world, which becomes the world of the father, which had been Apsu, her consort, who plays a very weak role here. He's dispensed with very early on, very quickly. And note, too, that the separation of the world parents, in all these other myths, in Hesiod, with the separation of the world parents, and in the older Sumerian myth, with the separation of An from Ki, the separation of the world parents, the separation act, takes place simply by slicing a goddess in half and pulling her apart. Her male lover is long since dead and gone. So there are no world parents here. This is all done by a single warrior hero who does all of this, translating the great unknown, the chaos principle that Peterson associates with the female, the feminine, simply assigning that gender to it, and overcoming it and translating it into the known world of the form for action, which he says that myth prescribes for. There's another myth, though, that he says there are some elements that are missing here that he thinks need to be addressed, that are addressed in the Egyptian myth of Osiris. So we need to turn to the Osiris myth now and just take a look at that briefly. The Osiris myth, it comes out of an Ennead in which there's an initial god named Atum who masturbates. And from his masturbation, he creates Shu and Tefnut, who are a primordial goddess and god pair who represent air and moisture bubbling up. And then they create Jeb and Nut. Jeb is the earth god, and Nut is the sky goddess. And Peterson acknowledges that, in fact, yes, in Egypt, sometimes you do have the earth associated with the male and the sky with the female. He does, at least he acknowledges that in this. They are separated by Shu. Shu is the god of moisture who comes in as the atmosphere and simply lifts up Nut, pushes her up with his arms like Atlas does. And you can see on Egyptian representations, the sky goddess is being held in an arch with spangled stars across her body, with Jeb down below looking up at her with an erect phallus, as though they had been in the act of coitus when Shu came in to separate them, as undoubtedly was probably originally the case. And note there now that the valency is that the woman is on top. The Egyptians liked the woman on top, whereas we'd seen before with the Babylonians that they liked the man on top. Very different sexual dynamics going on in these myths. So from Jeb and Nut, we get the brother-sister pairs, two of them, Osiris and his sister Isis, and Set and his sister Nephthys. And Osiris is the ruling pharaoh, and as the story goes, sometimes it says that Set was jealous of his brother and wanted to rule in his place, and that became the motivation. Or in some cases, it's said that Osiris slept with Nephthys, his brother's sister wife. In Egypt, it was okay for brothers and sisters to be consorts. They had no problem with that. So whatever the motivation was, Set became very angry at Osiris, wanted to overthrow him, took his measurements in secret, and then created a casket, specially designed to suit just him, and threw a party with his 72 friends. 72, that number, by the way, is significant because 72 is one of the key numbers for the precession of the equinoxes. Look that one up. You'll see that it's a key. There's a lot of archaeoastronomy, a lot of astronomical stuff is buried in these myths. These myths are not just proscriptions, as Peterson wants you to think, for action and behavior. They are also cognitive. He says, and I saw him somewhere on there, he said that they have nothing to do with contemplation and thinking and cognition. He's dead wrong about that. Myths store, they are the ancient tribal encyclopedia for the storage of knowledge, especially in oral traditions before they have been committed to writing, which always comes rather late. So oral traditions long since precede writing in every case. And they store knowledge. They store, Homer's Iliad is a tribal encyclopedia that if you examine carefully tells you how to build a ship. There's a passage in there where it's carefully described how you build a ship. This was oral knowledge passed along, prescriptive knowledge for how to do things, but it's also scientific knowledge for what's going on in the heavens, what the planets are doing. A lot of that archaeoastronomical stuff is going on and is buried in these myths, and it gets handed down as maps of the cosmos that are handed down for cognitive purposes to store knowledge in archives that are strictly from the mind, pre-existing any written archives. So then, anyway, getting back to the myth, so he throws a party. Osiris is invited. Everyone tries the casket, doesn't fit anyone. Osiris hops in, he fits perfectly. They clap a lid on, put 72 nails on it, throw it out into the Nile, and it goes floating down the river. It lands on a riverbank, and Osiris is the god of he actually is, in a way, he embodies the Jeb's generative force. He's the god that somehow underneath the earth gives it its power to generate plants and vegetation. And you see this, there are these wonderful little Egyptian miniature casket thingies that are made out of wood that have grass growing out of them in the shape of the body of Osiris. And so here his generative power is such that even while dead, he causes a tree to grow up over the casket and conceal it. This perfect, beautiful cosmic pillar that a king, perhaps this is in Byblos, a king comes along, says, that pillar would look great in my palace, let's take it. So they cut the pillar down. This is the pole star, by the way, more archaeoastronomy. They cut the pole down, they bring it into the king's palace. Isis goes wandering. Eventually she gets word that that's where the body is, inside the pillar. She hires herself out to this king as a babysitter for his infant. He says, okay, you got the job. She, as a goddess, thinks that she can make the baby immortal, as these goddesses often do, rolls him around in the flames to purify, burn away his mortality with the transformational power of flame, puts him in there, and the king comes in, he's horrified, fires her immediately, as would naturally happen. Now she has a Jordan Petersonian crisis event that comes. She's got to find a new job now. But she asks, the king says, can I take the pillar with me? He says for some reason he has no problem with that. So she takes it with her, digs the body of Osiris out of it, uses some incantational magic, just enough to get his phallus hard, so that she climbs on top of it. Again, the woman is on top in Egypt. Climbs on top of it, cowgirl style, rides him, and produces Horus from that act. So Horus is produced from the dead Osiris. She hides him away in the swamps while he's coming of age, hides Osiris's body away in the swamps. Set, one day while he's out hunting, finds it. When he finds it, he's enraged. He can't believe the body still exists, because this is a magical body. After all, he knows it still has power inherent within it, generative power. And so he has it torn into 14 different pieces, tossed to the four angles of the compass. 14 because that's half of a lunar cycle. Osiris is a moon god, like the moon, who dies and revives every month. 14 days, we got half of a lunar cycle. So Isis and Nephthys go looking around for the pieces of his body. They find the pieces of his body, and they hire out Tot and Anubis, the mortuary deities, to help them suture the pieces back together. They've got everything except the phallus, though, which has been swallowed by a fish, possibly impregnating it, as William Irwin Thompson remarked in one of his lectures for the Age of Pisces. So they've got that, and then the body is there. Meanwhile, Horus decides he has come of age, and he's going to avenge his father. So he goes out, he finds Set, and he says, you killed my father, and I'm here to avenge him. This is a very old myth. It goes all the way down to Hamlet. Fights him. They do battle. Set loses a testicle. Horus loses an eye. It's a stalemate, more or less, but Horus assumes the throne. And here's the important point that Peterson wants to draw your attention to. In assuming the throne, he remembers his father, and he wants to pull his father up from the underworld. He has the eye. The eye of Horus is magical. It has revivifying powers. It's basically the sun disk. So he descends down into the underworld, finds his father's dead body, and he shines the light of the eye of Horus on it, and it resurrects him. But he doesn't come up to the upper world. Peterson is mistaken about this. He does not come up to the upper world. Osiris remains as the central god in the underworld, as the lord of the judge of the dead. All the dead must face him. They all traverse down into the underworld to face him, and he is the god who judges their fate. He's always in the underworld. He never leaves it from that point on. He never comes up. The way Christ is able to do this, the Christian eschatos, is a whole different thing. We'll get to that later. And so the important thing about the myth, though, is that for Peterson, is that the son remembers the father and reclaims him, goes back and pulls him up. The reigning pharaoh was always the incarnation of Horus. And you can see in the statues, he's got the winged falcon. Horus is the falcon with the wings extending around his head. He is the falcon god, and the king is always the falcon. And so Horus is the incarnated living pharaoh, who is the son of the sun god Re, and who in turn, the previous pharaoh before him was Osiris, and is now dead. So this is identified with Osiris because all dead people were identified with Osiris. The Osiris name became a prefix to their name once they died. And so the dead pharaoh is Osiris. There's Horus. There's the completion of the myth. And so for Peterson, the important thing is the retrieval of the father from the underworld, which is missing from the Marduk myth. But note, I want to draw your attention to one interesting thing here before we can conclude this, is that the chaos principle. The chaos principle in the Enuma Elish is identified with the female, the dragon Tiamat, the dragon who is to be slain and tamed and overcome by masculine prowess and validity. But in the Egyptian myth, the chaos principle is actually represented by a male, Set. Set is always associated with monsters. In Greek, Egyptian myth, going all the way down, Set is always associated with weird creatures that Horus kills. It's one myth after the next in which Set is associated with a hippopotamus, and Horus comes out of the swamp and hurls his sun ray spear at the hippopotamus and kills him. Or sometimes it's a pig, a wild boar. But in any case, Set is always the chaos principle of this vegetation of the swamps that needs to be overcome. Or he also represents the chaos principle of the barbarians, the Hexos who come in, who worship Set as their primary divinity. Set's the negative divinity, the chaos principle, and he's male, not female. So note the gender difference here. It doesn't quite fit with Peterson's schema. And Set was always identified as the disturbing force in Egyptian cosmogony, and he is definitely female. male rather. The other problem too is that the unknown, this idea that chaos is always associated with the unknown. You can very well have in your map of meaning, just in your daily orientation, you can have lots of chaotic elements there that are not unknown at all. You know very well what they are. The grass has to be mown or it turns into a chaos principle and overcomes your yard. But it's not unknown. You know very well what it is. It's grass. It's a chaotic principle that has to be overcome. I have to shave my beard every so often or it becomes chaotic. But it's not unknown. I know very well what it is. So there are all these signifiers that are unaccounted for in Jordan Peterson's map that fall under the category of something that we know very well what it is. It's not unknown. It's not something that needs to be translated into the archive of a culture as new knowledge. It still remains a chaos principle, but one that is known, which if a Deridian would come into this system, would point this out as an undecidable that would deconstruct the absolute opposition between the known and the unknown, which he sets up as what Peter Sloterdijk calls a bivalent ontology. So that's Peterson up to that point.